the Children's Crusade. When 30,000 kids were tricked into slavery, they called it a miracle. A whisper passed from village to village, from ruined church to broken farm. It didn't come from the bishops or the nobles or the pope. It came from the mouths of children. "God has spoken to us," they said. "We're going to the Holy Land, and He will part the sea for us." That's how it started, not with swords or banners, but with barefoot kids, wide-eyed and sunburnt, preaching salvation. It was the year 1212, and the grown-ups of Europe were already tired of crusades. For over 100 years, kings and knights had hurled themselves across continents to seize Jerusalem, spilling rivers of blood and never keeping it for long. But now, somehow, in the middle of famine and plague, children were taking up the call. Not knights, not warriors, children. The first spark came from France. In a village near Vendôme, a 12-year-old shepherd named Stephen stood up in a market square and said he had a letter from Jesus Christ himself. Not the church, not the priests, from Jesus. He claimed Christ appeared to him as a pilgrim and handed him a message. "Lead a crusade of innocence. Only children, pure and sinless, can succeed where men have failed." And somehow, Stephen didn't just inspire a few followers, he lit a wildfire. Word spread faster than the church could contain it. Within weeks, thousands of children had left their homes, abandoned their parents, and marched to follow Stephen toward the sea. Some were orphans, others were runaways, some were just swept up in the excitement. They believed, truly, madly believed, that they were chosen, that they were holy, that their purity would unlock miracles. But what no one talks about is how quickly that innocence was devoured. As the first wave of children moved through the countryside, more began to join. Reports claim that 20,000 to 30,000 children left France alone. And this wasn't some organized parade. It was chaos, barefoot masses, stumbling through mountains, woods, and ravaged towns, begging for food, dying from heat, and singing hymns they barely understood. They wore nothing but rags. Most couldn't read. None were prepared for the journey they were about to take. But they marched, through Lyon, through Marseille, through cities that didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Adults watched from windows. Some offered water, some threw stones. The clergy panicked. Bishops condemned the movement, saying it had no official blessing. The Pope himself refused to recognize the crusade. But no one could stop it. These kids weren't waiting for permission. They were chasing a promise. And the promise was this: God would part the sea for them. They believed they would reach the Mediterranean, pray, and watch the waters split, like Moses in the Bible, so they could walk dry-footed to Jerusalem. That was the miracle they had been told. That was what Stephen preached. But when they arrived in Marseille, the sea did not part. It didn't ripple. It didn't whisper. It just sat there, vast, blue, and unmovable. Some children wept. Some screamed. Others fell to their knees in prayer, convinced they had failed somehow. But then came the second lie. Two local merchants, Hugo Farias and William Porcus, appeared like saviors. They told the children not to worry. God had sent them instead. They had ships, 7 of them, and they would take the children to the Holy Land, free of charge. No strings, no catch. It sounded like divine intervention, a miracle replacement. What the sea wouldn't part, they would sail. The children, overjoyed, boarded the ships without question. They were never seen again. That's not poetic. That's a documented fact. Thousands of children boarded those 7 ships and vanished. Years later, one of the boys, now a grown man, would escape and tell the truth. The ships didn't sail to Jerusalem. They sailed straight into slavery. The merchants had struck a deal with Muslim slave traders in North Africa. 2 ships sank in a storm, killing everyone on board. The rest arrived in Tunis and were sold, like cattle, like meat, into the markets. Boys were taken as servants. Girls were sold to harems. The Crusade had become a human cargo shipment, all in the name of faith, all under the lie of divine purpose. But the nightmare didn't end in France, because at the same time, hundreds of miles away, a second children's crusade was rising in Germany. A boy named Nicholas, around 10 years old, claimed that he too had been called by God. And just like Stephen, he became a child preacher, drawing thousands of followers. Some historians estimate another 20,000 kids joined his march, and they too believed that if they could reach Italy, the sea would part. They climbed over the Alps, barefoot, starving, and freezing, only to find nothing waiting for them. No miracle, no ships, just Roman guards who turned them away. Many died in the mountains. Others were captured or forced into labor. The lucky ones? They made it home, older, broken, and betrayed. This wasn't just misguided hope. It was mass manipulation on a scale nobody talks about. Parents begged their kids not to go. Communities pleaded with local priests to intervene. But the fire had already caught. The idea that purity could save Jerusalem was so intoxicating, so radical, that even adults hesitated to argue. And the Church, rather than stop it, turned its back. The Pope, Innocent III, made a statement later, calling the children's zeal admirable, but ultimately declared the crusade unauthorized. That was it. That was the whole response. No rescue missions, no recovery efforts, just silence. Because acknowledging the truth meant admitting something monstrous, that an entire generation of children, thousands of them, were trafficked, tricked, and killed under the guise of faith. That those who survived were either enslaved or left traumatized, and that it all could have been stopped. But no one wanted to admit how willingly they watched it happen. What's more horrifying? That no one stopped it. Or that it was allowed to happen twice. Because historians still argue today about whether the French and German Crusades were separate events or part of one massive movement. But the facts remain. In 1212, Europe watched tens of thousands of children disappear, and then rewrote history to make it seem like a myth, a parable, a tragic legend of misguided youth, as if calling it fiction could erase the blood on everyone's hands. And the child preachers? Stephen disappeared. Nicholas vanished. No trials, no questions, no apologies, just silence. In some versions, Nicholas's father was executed for starting the movement. Not because they cared about the kids, but because he embarrassed the church. That's how power works. It doesn't punish lies, it punishes exposure. But their followers? They never came home. And if they did, they were never the same. We remember kings who conquered. We remember popes who declared wars. But we forget the children. We forget the ones who believed so hard they walked into chains. And we forget that behind every noble crusade was a marketplace waiting to cash in on flesh, innocence, and desperation. That's the history you were never taught. That's the one they scrubbed from the classroom. Because if you knew what really happened in 1212, you'd never look at a crusade or a sermon the same way again. The real betrayal wasn't the ships. It wasn't the sea. It wasn't even the slave traders waiting on the other side of the Mediterranean. The true betrayal was the silence that followed. Thousands of children, gone. Whole towns emptied of youth. Parents left staring at fields that would never be harvested again, windows that would never be opened by their sons or daughters again, names whispered into the night with no answer. And yet the world moved on. The church closed its doors. The nobles returned to their feasts. The cities that had watched the children march through them simply carried on with their markets and their prayers, as if nothing had happened. No one raised a monument. No one held a service. The loss became a shadow, too shameful to name, too large to face. It was swept beneath the altars between the pages of Scripture, buried not with the dead, but with the guilt. But if you listen closely, If you read between the lines of the dusty chronicles and faded parchments, you start to hear the outlines of a truth that's been gagged for 800 years. Some accounts say that the few who survived and returned from North Africa were changed beyond recognition, not just in body but in soul. They spoke of markets where children were bought by the pound, of priests who turned their robes inside out and became translators for the captors, of young girls handed over not to soldiers, but to high-ranking clergy who claimed they were rescuing them, and then disappeared with them into the desert. One boy, it said, made it back to France and tried to speak to a bishop about what happened. The bishop had him locked up in a monastery, not to help him, to silence him. And if you're wondering why this story is only told in half-whispers and contradictions, that's because the people who wrote history weren't the ones who lived through it. They were the ones who profited from it. The medieval chroniclers were monks, court historians, and scribes on papal payrolls. You think they were going to put that in ink? That children were sold in God's name? That the people who claimed to save their souls were the ones who chained their bodies? Of course not. So the narrative shifted. The children were rebranded as foolish, misled, delusional. It became a cautionary tale, not a criminal investigation. That's the final betrayal, turning a tragedy into a footnote. And what about Stephen and Nicholas, the child prophets? Some say Stephen was arrested. Others claim he was absorbed into a monastery and never spoke again. But there are darker whispers, that he was killed quietly to prevent any more questions. Nicholas, according to one obscure German account, tried to reach Rome to beg the Pope for help, but he never made it. He died on the road, no grave, no markers, just the dust of Italy to swallow the last breath of a boy who believed God was listening. And that's the part that hits hardest. These kids believed. They weren't mercenaries or zealots. They didn't go for land or loot. They genuinely thought they were answering a divine call. When they sang in the streets, it wasn't for show. When they knelt by the sea, it wasn't a performance. They were pure. And that purity was weaponized. Adults saw their hope and turned it into cargo. Men saw their faith and turned it into flesh to be bought. And the most terrifying part? That kind of exploitation never went away. We just gave it new names. You see it in modern headlines: child labor, human trafficking, exploited belief. It's the same pattern, dressed in newer clothes. You think 12/12 was unique? It wasn't. It was just the first time the world watched it happen on a mass scale, and then looked away. The Children's Crusade is more than a lost chapter. It's a blueprint of how power feeds on innocence, and it's still feeding today. And listen, if you're still here with me, still riding through this twisted mess of faith, fear, and forgotten kids, then you already know what I'm about to say. You know this is the kind of story they never wanted you to hear, the kind that doesn't make it into school books or museum plaques, but we tell it anyway, because this is Uncle Luke Tells, and we drag the buried bones of history right into the sunlight. So if you want more twisted truths, raw betrayals, and stories the world tried to erase, then you know what to do. Hit that like button, drop a comment, subscribe so you never miss the stories they swore you'd never hear, because we're not stopping. Not today, not ever. Now, let's go deeper. Let's talk about what came after the Crusade. Because while the children were marched into slavery, while parents mourned and nobles laughed and churches locked their doors, a new wave of copycats emerged. Across Europe, in the years following 1212, smaller movements began to rise. Teenagers preaching on street corners, little girls claiming visions, entire villages swept into spiritual hysteria, convinced they too could follow in the footsteps of the so-called holy children. The church scrambled to control it, issuing edicts and warnings, labeling the movements heretical. But the flame had already caught. Even centuries later, in the 15th and 16th centuries, echoes of the Children's Crusade resurfaced in paintings, poetry, and folklore, but always as legend, never as truth, because if the truth was told, the institutions we still trust today would have to answer for it. And let's not forget, the merchants who sold those children, they didn't vanish. They weren't punished. Hugo Farias and William Porcus walked away rich. They returned to France and lived as respected businessmen. There were no trials, no public floggings. No one stood up in a square and shouted their names, because they were protected, not just by money, by the church, the state, and silence. They were tools of the system, and the system needed their kind to survive. The Children's Crusade isn't just a moment in history. It's a mirror. It shows us how easily idealism can be weaponized, how quickly innocence can be devoured, and how deep institutions will dig to hide the bodies, literal and metaphorical. It's the kind of story that makes you question everything, your textbooks, your leaders, your prayers, because once you see what happened to those kids, once you feel it, you can't unsee it. And that's why they buried it, but it didn't stay buried. Not here, not with us. Because at Uncle Luke Tells, we don't do bedtime stories. We do the real ones, the messy, monstrous, and magnificent truths that built this world and broke it at the same time. So stick around, because we've still got one more section to go, and in that one, we'll uncover what really happened in the aftermath, the long-term scars, the cover-ups, and the survivors who tried against all odds to make the world remember what the world tried so hard to forget. There's a reason the Children's Crusade feels like fiction. It sounds too tragic, too outrageous, too insane to be real. Tens of thousands of kids marching to a foreign land on foot, convinced that the sea would part for them. It's a parable, right? A medieval metaphor? That's what they want you to think. Because if you believe it was just a fairy tale, you won't ask where the bodies are buried. You won't ask who got rich. You won't ask how an entire continent let it happen, and then pretended it didn't. But make no mistake, this happened, and the aftermath was even more twisted than the journey. Let's start with what Europe did after the children vanished. You'd expect outrage, mourning, at least an attempt to find the missing, but no. What came instead was an erasure, a surgical, calculated erasure. Priests called it a tragedy of zeal. Scholars reduced it to misguided passion. Chroniclers started adding phrases like, "it is said," or "some believe," to every account, slowly pushing the event into the realm of myth. Why? Because acknowledging it meant admitting complicity. It meant admitting that faith had been used not as a lifeline, but as a noose, that kings and bishops alike had watched thousands of children vanish into the sea, not with horror, but with relief. Fewer mouths to feed, fewer rebels to raise, fewer problems to solve. And then came the cover stories. In some versions, the children never even made it to the sea. They turned back, these stories say. They got tired. They were rescued by kind townspeople. The movement was short-lived, harmless, sweet even. In other retellings, the children were caught by bandits or eaten by wolves. Tragic but natural. Nothing human to blame. Nothing institutional. Just the cruelty of the world. Nature's fault. God's test. But the darkest manipulation came from the church itself. Because even though Pope Innocent III publicly condemned the crusade as unauthorized, the event became weaponized in a different way. Sermons began to emerge, using the Children's Crusade as a warning, not to the church, to children. Obey your parents, follow the priests, stay in school, do not take action on your own. The entire narrative was flipped. These kids weren't victims. They were rebels. They weren't betrayed. They strayed. The story became a cautionary tale about disobedience, not exploitation. And just like that, Europe moved on. But not everyone forgot. In a small town near Cologne, one mother reportedly kept her son's shoes by the door until the day she died. In Marseille, local legend says the sound of singing children can still be heard in the docks on stormy nights. The voices of those who never reached shore. In Lyon, a faded stone in the church courtyard bears no name, but locals call it the Weeping Stone. They say a mother knelt there for 40 years, waiting for her 2 daughters to return from the Crusade. Some nights, when the mist is just right, it still feels warm. And then there are the survivors. Yes, a handful did survive. Most were never heard from again. But a few clawed their way back from North Africa decades later. What they described was worse than any sermon, any scripture. They spoke of children chained in pits for weeks before being sorted and sold, of buyers lined up with silver coins, poking at bodies like they were inspecting livestock, of little girls stripped naked and paraded before sheikhs, of boys trained to become eunuchs for royal courts, and of Christians, yes, Christians, who participated in the trade. Not just Muslims, not just outsiders. Some of the slave ships had been funded by Italian bankers. Some of the buyers were European lords collecting servants like trophies. One survivor, a boy from France who escaped at the age of 32, returned to his village only to find his home abandoned, his family gone, and his name erased. No one believed him. They thought he was insane. He died alone in a field just outside the church that once blessed him. Another, a German girl, was said to have lived in silence for the rest of her life, refusing to speak a single word. Her last known act was burning a Bible in her cottage fireplace. The villagers said she was possessed. They never considered she might be traumatized. But the part they don't want you to know, the part that truly blows the mask off this entire lie, is what happened to the idea of the Children's Crusade. Because even though the event was suppressed, the machinery it revealed didn't stop. In fact, it got stronger, more refined, more strategic. Over the next century, dozens of children's movements were launched by various religious groups, often used to gather donations or support for vague missions abroad. None of them ended in slaughter, not like 1212, but the structure was there. Emotional manipulation, promises of glory, purity as a weapon, kids as pawns. And still today, the echoes linger. Think about it. How many modern stories follow the same pattern? A charismatic child, a righteous cause, a group of innocent followers, and then betrayal, tragedy, silence. We see it in cults. We see it in extremist groups. We even see it in politics. The Children's Crusade wasn't just a bizarre footnote. It was a prototype, a test run, and it worked. Now there are scholars, brave ones, who have tried to bring this truth to light, but they're often dismissed as fringe historians, conspiracy theorists, or too emotional. Because the moment you admit that faith and power have always exploited children, you start pulling a thread that unravels the entire fabric of Western history, and they can't have that. So the textbooks stay clean, the church windows stay stained, and the whispers stay whispers. But this story won't go quietly. Not here. Not anymore. Because when you dig into the details, you realize just how deep the deception goes. For instance, did you know that the names of the merchants who trafficked the children, Hugo Ferreus and William Porcus, were recorded in full detail, but not prosecuted? They appeared in court records for other business dealings, long after the Crusade. One even became a city official. That's right. A man who orchestrated the enslavement of thousands of children later handed out trade licenses in Marseille. And no one blinked. Why? Because slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was profitable. And those kids, they weren't rich, they weren't noble, they weren't useful to anyone except as product. And what about the parents? Well, many were too poor to search. A few wrote letters to Rome, begging, pleading, but never got a reply. Some were told their children had gone to heaven. Others were told they had been mistaken. Their sons and daughters had never joined the crusade at all. Some were excommunicated for making a fuss. One woman who reportedly stormed a local abbey demanding answers was beaten and accused of witchcraft. That's how fragile the story was. Even one grieving mother was considered a threat. And then there's this. The church eventually canonized several saints who had nothing to do with the crusade, but who centuries later were used to represent the spirit of those lost children. It's a PR move in religious form. They took a tragedy, whitewashed it with sainthood, and hoped no one would look too closely. And for the most part, they didn't. But we're looking now. And what we see is this. The Children's Crusade wasn't a mistake. It was a system. It was a machine built to harvest belief and convert it into coin. It took the purest thing in the world, a child's trust, and sold it for silver. And the fact that it was erased doesn't make it go away. It makes it worse. Because when a society can let something like that happen and then bury it, it tells you everything you need to know about who really runs the story, about what really gets remembered, about whose pain is worth writing down. So now you know. The next time someone talks about the glory of the Crusades, ask them about 1212. Ask them about the sea that didn't part, the ships that never returned, the children who marched toward God and found only chains. And when they tell you it's just a legend, you look them dead in the eyes and say, legends don't leave empty beds.